So we are looking at Perek Shmini, the 8th Perek of Tamar Devorah. And as you know, the 8th Perek is dealing with Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, which we haven't gotten to yet. And Netzach and Hod, in this analogy, are described as the thighs or the legs. Netzach is the right leg, and Hod, glory, is the left leg. And the Ramak says they could be seen as the supports for Tiferes, which is Torah. Right? So in an earlier chapter, they were described as the Talmidim of Tiferes. In this chapter, they are described as the supports of Tiferes. And therefore, the avodah of how we emulate Netzach and Hod is through what is called Hachzakas Torah, the support that we give for Torah. And the Ramak mentioned 3 areas of support. One is financial, including eating, drinking, living arrangements, and the like. The second is to create the infrastructure of a Beis Medrash and Sfarim, which is also financial, but it's not financial in terms of physical tzurachim, but in terms of learning needs. And the third is the psychological chizuk that we give to Lomdei Torah by making them understand that what they're doing is very valuable. So when we become machzikei Torah, we connect to Netzach and Hod that are the machzikim of Tiferes. In this sense, the Ramak does not differentiate, and he makes the point that he's not differentiating between the role of Netzach and the role of Hod. He is looking at 2 of them the same way. Later he'll mention some chiluk between them, in which both of them represent the notion of Hachzakas Torah. So I just want to mention a little bit more about Hachzakas Torah generally. In Parshas Truma, when the Torah describes the building of the Aron HaKodesh that was kept in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and this is true in the Mishkan, and this is true in the first Beis HaMikdash, you know it was not true in the second Beis HaMikdash. Second Beis HaMikdash, there was no Aron HaKodesh, because Yoshio HaMelech, in anticipation of knowing that the Babylonians were going to eventually destroy the temple, he had the Aron HaKodesh removed from the Kodesh HaKadoshim and concealed in a subterranean chamber of the Beis HaMikdash, under the Beis HaMikdash. So that's the Raiders of the Lost Ark story is based on that idea. And it was never recovered. It was never recovered. In the second Beis HaMikdash, there was no Aron HaKodesh. Now, people ask a kasha, although it's an obvious answer. So, if the original Aron gets lost, why don't they just make a replacement Aron? After all, at the time of the Yavanim, the menorah of Moshe was stolen and melted down, and they made a new menorah. So if they made a new menorah, why can't they make a new Aron HaKodesh? Right, that's a kasha. But the answer is very pashut. It's not so much the Aron. A new Aron could be made, but the Aron has to contain the luchais, both the first luchais, which were shattered, and the second luchais. Now that comes from God. So if we don't have that, the Aron HaKodesh, there's no mitzvah to have an Aron that does not contain the luchos habris. Okay, so that's why there literally was no Aron in the Bayis Sheni. So when the Kohen Gadol walked into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, what did the Kohen Gadol see in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The answer is he saw nothing. The only thing that there was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim was the Even Shesiyah. There was an outcropping of rock there, and the sprinkling of the blood that would normally take place between the staffs or the staves of the Aron was instead simply on top of the Even Shesiyah. Right? There was no Aron HaKodesh in the Bayis Sheni. So it's interesting, just in terms of all of this. There seems to be a Messiah, although it's not definitive in Chazal, that the Aron HaKodesh is still in that subterranean chamber of the Beis HaMikdash. So for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, there have been archaeologists or people who are trying to find the Ark. Again, Raiders of the Lost Ark is based on trying to find the Ark. And they tell a story about an individual who actually claimed to have found the Aron HaKodesh. And he brought the information to the Chafetz Chaim. And he showed the Chafetz Chaim the diagram of where he went and what he saw. And the Chafetz Chaim said, give me the paper. The Chafetz Chaim burnt the paper. And the Chafetz Chaim made the person swear, b'shvuah, that he would not reveal the whereabouts of the Aron. So apparently there is an idea that it's there. Of course, there's also a recurring legend that the Vatican has the menorah. That probably is not true, even though the Arch of Titus, they're carrying away the menorah, but in the course of time, those things got melted down and the like. But the Aron HaKodesh never fell into foreign hands, except, of course, the one time when the Philistines, the Pelishtim, took the Aron HaKodesh. And even then, many say that was a second Aron HaKodesh. That was not the Aron HaKodesh of the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's a big machlokas in the Gemara. Which Aron did they take? Now, just as an aside, in the Aron HaKodesh, we paskin, there are actually three things in the Aron HaKodesh. There is the fragments of the first luchais. There is the intact second luchais. And according to one opinion in the Gemara, there actually is a Sefer Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. So according to one opinion, that was outside of the ark, to the side of the ark. According to another opinion, it was actually in the Aron HaKodesh itself. And that was actually the official Sefer Torah. Just like, they have, they used to call it the National Bureau of Standards. I'm sure Israel has it as well, but in America, there's an official government agency that is in charge of what is an inch, what is a foot, what is a yard, official everything. So whenever there's a doubt about, whatever the doubt would be, no, the definition of an inch is defined. In fact, it even applies to time. What is a second, what is a minute, and the like, called the National Bureau of Standards. So lahavdil, Moshe Rabbeinu's Sefer Torah was the official text, as you might expect. Which means the Gemara says an amazing thing that you don't think about this. Whenever there were different Sifrei Torah that had different nuschos, small differences that do exist even today, they would resolve the differences by checking it against the Torah scroll of Moshe. Now, what does that mean? That means somebody went into the Kodesh HaKodashim, somebody opened the Aron, lifted up the Kaporos, took out the Sefer Torah, and checked it. So the idea that only one time a year, only one person entered the Aron HaKodesh, entered the Kodesh HaKodashim, is strictly speaking not 100% true, because people were permitted. In fact, it's not even clear it had to be the Kohen Gadol. People were permitted to enter the Aron HaKodesh in order to look at the Sefer Torah Shel Moshe. Now, how often did that happen? I have no idea. I don't think we have a record of how often that happened, but at least in theory, that did happen, right? So people did enter the Kodesh HaKodashim. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though you couldn't normally enter the Kodesh HaKodashim, except for the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, the Kodesh HaKodashim was actually open during the Shalosh Regalim. In other words, during the Shalosh Regalim, when all of the Jews come to Yerushalayim, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, during the Bayis Rishon, they would open the paroches so people could see into the Kodesh HaKodashim. And they could see the Ark. They could see the Aron. If you have ever studied about the layout of the Beis HaMikdash, of course, Maseches Midos is about the second Mikdash, but the truth is, in this respect, the first Mikdash of Shlomo is the same. All the doors were directly opposite each other, meaning to say, if you're standing at one entrance, you could see straight all the way to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and if the Parochos was open, you would see into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, although you had to have good eyesight because you're a distance. So what they would do is that when the Jewish people would be in the temple courtyard, in the Azara, they would not be in the Heichal. Only Kohanim can go into the Heichal. But if they're in the Azara, and the doors of the Heichal are open, the gate of Niknor, and then you have the Parochas being open, they could stand in the Azara, and if they're standing in front of the gate of Niknor, of course a lot of people couldn't, whatever it is, but if you manage to position yourself in front of the gate of Niknor, you could see into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Although it was a distance, it was something like 180 amos, it was like 360 feet, but that's a long distance. But theoretically you could see it. Now, what was the purpose of opening the Parochas so people could see into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Because on top of the Aron HaKodesh, there's a gold cover that's called kaporas. Okay, don't confuse the two words. There's paroches and there is kaporas. Okay, what's the difference? Paroches is the curtain that divides the Heichal from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's just the curtain. Kaporas is the gold cover on top of the Aron HaKodesh itself. Kaporas. Now, on the Kaporas are two kruvim, the images of two angels. So the Gemara mentions that there was a miracle associated with these angels, and that is when Klal Yisrael were osin ritzonai shel makom, when they were doing the will of God, the angels would embrace each other. And when Klal Yisrael was not doing the will of God, they turned away from each other. So as a result, the Jewish people got their report card during the Shalosh Regalim, that if they were living on a high level, it was a very good message. The Kruvim were embracing. And what was the message? Re'u chibaschem lifnei hamakayim. See how much you are loved by God. And if chas v'shalom they were turning away, that was also a message. You got to do tshuva. You got to improve. Now this is during the first mikdash, because during the second mikdash there was no Aron HaKodesh, there was no kruvim. Now, the Gemara then asks in Yuma, but wait a second, you're not allowed to look at the Aron HaKodesh. Forget about the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Even when the Aron was being transported in the Midbar, right? The Torah says it had to be covered into chelas cloth. So people should not look at the Aron. So, Eino Chinami, opening up the Paroches, nobody is entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but how could they be mistakel the Aron? It's prohibited to look at the Aron HaKodesh. So the Gemara explains that that only applied until they came to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the Isser of looking at the Aron HaKodesh and having it to be covered up, that only applied in Eretz Yisrael, only in the desert, because in the desert, our relationship to God was that of an arusa, like a betrothed woman. We were not fully married. So a betrothed woman cannot be overly familiar with her husband. Once we enter Eretz Yisrael, we become nesua. We become fully married to God, and therefore we have access to the Aron and the like. That is why I think you find that when David HaMelech brought the Aron HaKodesh, this is before there was a Beis HaMikdash, from Kiryas Ye'arim, where it resided for 20 years after it was reclaimed from the Pelishtim. So there was a whole procession. You don't find any reference to the Aron being covered up. There were tragedies in touching the Aron, people died, etc., but you don't find a direct reference to the Aron being covered up, because there was no Isser of being mistakel the Aron in Eretz Yisrael proper, because in Eretz Israel, we are no longer the Arusa of Hashem. We are the Nesua of Hashem. This is the Gemara in Maseches Yuma. Now, let's go back a little bit. So in the Aron, we have the Luchais and the Shivrei Luchais. So why are the Shivrei Luchais in the Aron? Like, what's the purpose? They're not our Torah. Our Torah is the second Luchais. So the Gemara in the Darim says a wonderful, wonderful lesson here. It talks about a Zaken Sheshachach Talmudai. What does that basically mean? It means an elderly person who is forgetting his learning through illness, through dementia, through Alzheimer's, whatever it would be. So you might think, he's not a Talmud Chacham anymore. Why should I honor him? So it says, no. A Zaken Sheshachach Talmudai, you must still treat with honor and homage and respect, because even the broken fragments of the Luchais are given the place of honor in the Aron HaKodesh. So the Talmud Chacham is treated as the broken Luchais. The broken Luchais still have Kedusha. It's a beautiful thought of looking at a person in spite of their disabilities, in spite of their limitations. Their essence is essentially a holy essence, a sanctified essence. And in Torah in particular, it's that way because, you see, the impact of Torah on a person goes beyond the conscious information that happens to be in their head. A person learns Torah for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years. So maybe, because of illness or whatever it is, most of the information is not there. But this neshama absorbed that connection to God. That doesn't go away. The data may not be there, but the spiritual reshim of that Torah learning is part of the reality of his Metzias. That is who he is. And for that, you have to honor him. His neshama is irradiated, so to speak, with the Torah Hashem. Okay. Now, all of this is by way of digression to the primary point. Now, we know we have an Aron HaKodesh, and there are rings, and the gold rings on the side of the Aron, and in those gold rings, staves or poles are inserted. And when the Leviim would carry the Aron, right, they would stand in front and in back, and they would carry the Aron on their shoulders. And this was an avodah that was given to the Bnei Kahas. These are called Badei HaAron, the staffs or the poles of the Aron. Now the Torah has a very interesting halacha. The Badei HaAron are not allowed to be removed from the Aron even when the Aron is at rest. Meaning, you don't put the Aron in the Kodesh HaKodashim, then take away the poles. And when it's time to travel again, put in the poles and carry the Aron. Rather, the Badei HaAron have to remain with the Aron even when the Aron is at rest. In point of fact, this is a lav in the Torah. Lo Yasuru Mimeno. The Gemara says, if a person would remove the Badei HaAron from the Aron and they would be given warning, don't do that, they would get 39 malchus. It is a lo sas in the Torah for which a person gets malchus if he removes the Badei HaAron from the Aron. In fact, Rashi says that the Parechas had bumps in it, meaning to say the Aron is in the Kodesh HaKodashim. You have the Parechas, the Badim are sticking out, the bumps. From the outside of the Parechas, you would see the bumps of the Badim. So, this is in the Chumash Beferish. The Badei HaAron cannot be removed from the Aron. Lo Yasuru Mimenu. So the Chavetz Chaim says, there's a very important lesson here. The Aron, of course, is a symbol of Torah and Torah learning. It has the Torah in it, it has the Luchais in it. The Badei HaOrain, the poles of the Orain, represent those that support Torah. They carried the Torah. They enabled the Torah to move, to flourish, to be successful. So the Torah's merames, even when the Talmidei Chachamim are at rest in Olam Haba, and they no longer have to struggle, the Machzikei Torah remain with them in their eternal rest in Olam Haba. Meaning those who carried Torah in its sojourn in the world will rest with the Talmidei Chachamim in the world to come. Badei ha'arayin lo yasuru mimenu, the Chavetz Chaim says, that is the remez to the Badei ha'arayin. So this gives rise, of course, to the phenomenon known as Yisachar and Zevulun. Right? Yisachar and Zevulun were the two brothers, in which Yisachar was a shevet that primarily dedicated itself to Torah learning, and Zevulun, through commerce, provided economic support to Yisachar, and we are told that Yisachar is a partner with, Zevulun is a partner with Yisachar in all of its reward. Because Zevulun provided the physical sustenance and Yisachar provided the learning. Now, a few points to make here. Number one, this does not exempt the Zevuluns of the world from learning. A Zevulun is not putter from learning because he supports yeshivas. But it means his primary avodah was Achzakas Torah. Now, what do we mean when we say the Yisachar and Zevulun are equal in reward? They divide the reward. What does it mean, dividing the reward? So there are actually three different shittas how Yisachar and Zevulun divide their reward in Olam Haba. Shitta number one is 50-50, meaning to say Zevulun gets half of the reward and Yisachar gets half of the reward. Now, if you think about that, one might say that's a bad deal for the Yisachars of the world. Because if I would be learning without the support, again, let's just quantify. Let's imagine, I'm going to use meaningless numbers. Let's imagine my sechar for learning all day is 1,000,000 Olam Haba units. Okay, it's a meaningless number. So you support me in my Torah learning. So I only get 500,000 units, and you get 500,000 units. I've lost 500,000 units. So why would a Talmid Chacham ever consent to a Yisachar Zevulun partnership? The answer is, the reason why he would consent, besides the obvious question, he has to put bread on his table, is that even though I'm only going to get half of the units, presumably I'll be able to learn more because of the support. Meaning, the way it works is this. If I have economic security, I can concentrate better, I can learn longer hours, I don't need, right? So the pshat is like this. I may come out ahead, even in terms of numbers. Meaning, yes, without the financial support, I would get 100% of my learning rewarded. But that might be less learning, and the quality might be less. So as a result, getting 50% through the Yisachar Zevulun Shutfus may in fact give me more sechar than I would get at 100% when I would accomplish less, right? So that's answer number one. That is called the 50-50 division. There is another shita that says 100-100. God is infinite. And that is, if my learning entitles me to 1,000,000 units of Olam Haba, then God will just duplicate it for the other guy. You're a co-partner. So therefore, both of us get 100%. God duplicates the reward of the Yisachar and gives it to the Zevulun. That, of course, makes it a very mutually beneficial arrangement. There is a third view that's interesting, and that is Yisachar gets 100% and Zevulun gets 50%, meaning to say it's not 50-50, it's 150, meaning Zevulun gets half of Yisachar, but it doesn't come out of Yisachar in any way. So we have three different shitas, 50-50, 100-100, or 50-100. Right? There are three. Now, keep in mind the following. This formula only works when Zevulun is providing all of Yisachar's needs. If Zevulun provides only 10%, so then you have to adjust all of these amounts. So instead of 50-50, it will be 90-10, etc. And whatever, in other words, the 50-50 presupposes Yisachar is the learner and Zevulun is providing all of the support. Anything less would have to be adjusted based on the percentage of the economic needs that are being met. To this day, there are people who engage, many people, who have official Yisachar-Zevulun partnerships, and they draw up contracts. It's a contract. It's not just, I give money to a yeshiva. We have a partnership contract and the like. Okay. I'm sorry, did you had your hand up?
I guess the model I was thinking is, you bring me a whole bunch of firewood, and then I start the fire. It's like we both benefit 100% from the light and the heat. So it's like, I guess I could have gathered more firewood, or something like that.
Right.
Oh man, I don't know, but there seems to
So that would be, so you think that's the 100-100, everybody?
Yeah, I
right. Everybody benefits from that unit. Now, it's interesting, Maisa, they tell, just to give you an example, that although it looks like the Zevulun is taking care of the Yisachar, but it's also true that the Yisachar is taking care of the Zevulun, not only in the world to come, but even in this world itself. They point out that by the Aron HaKodesh you had a very interesting phenomenon, that the Aron nosei es nosav, meaning Levium are carrying the Aron through the poles that are on their shoulders, but in fact, the Aron was carrying them, meaning the Aron was light. It's as if it was lifting them up. And that's a great remez, right? Because those who carry the Aron are the Machzikei Torah, and the Torah is actually sustaining them. They tell a Maisa, it's an old Maisa, about a man who married a woman, and he was a big Talmid Chacham, and his in-laws wanted to support him in learning as long as they could, for many, many years. And the in-laws eventually got very old and not so well, and the son-in-law didn't really want them to work anymore. He wanted them to retire. He wanted them to take it easy a little bit. And he said, listen, I'll get a job. I'll get a job as a Rav, or get a job as a Magid Shir or a Rosh Hashiva. And the in-laws begged him to let them support him, because they said, who knows who's giving life to whom? We're supporting you, but maybe in the merit of supporting you, Hashem has given us life. But the son-in-law, actually this is a laudable son-in-law, we don't have enough son-in-laws like this, but the son-in-law felt so bad that he was making his elderly in-laws work, that he bedafka didn't want that anymore, and he decided to look for employment. And the story goes that his in-laws died very shortly thereafter, because if they were no longer actively being machzik Torah, they didn't have the zechus of the Torah to continue to give them life. So they says, who knows who is supporting whom? The Zevuluns are certainly supporting the Yisachars, but the Yisachars are also supporting the Zevuluns. Gives a zechus. Sometimes a person is given life only because of the hachzakas Torah that they bring to the world. Okay, so that's the minyan of hachzakas Torah, and that is how we link to Netzach and Hod, which are the machzikei Torah. So that's the first thing. Now then, he goes back to another point about Netzach, and now he goes back to his first imagery. Remember, Netzach and Hod have two metaphorical descriptions. They are described as the Talmidim of Netzach, the Talmidim of Tiferes. That was the earlier parak. And they are described as the supporters of Tiferes. So until now, we've been looking at it from the supporter analogy. Now he reverts back to the earlier analogy that Netzach and Hod are called Limudei Hashem. They are called Talmidim. So how do I link myself to that aspect of Netzach and Hod? So he says, by being a person who is willing to learn Mikol Adam. Right? We say, Ezeu Chacham, who is a wise person? Halomed Mikol Adam, a person who learns from everybody. So you got to be a perpetual Talmud, meaning just like Netzach and Hod are perpetually Talmidim of Tiferes, you got to be a Talmud of Lomed Mikol Adam. And here the Ramak says, a person, okay, people might argue with some of this, a person should not only get his Torah from Rav Echad, a person should try to get his Torah from many, many teachers and try to learn something valuable from each type of Rebbe, each type of teacher, each type of Chaver that they're able to learn from. Now, to some degree, this once again is connected to humility, but it also goes beyond that, and that is simply because the Torah is infinite. And many, infinite perspectives exist within infinity. And from each person, I could get a different insight, a different Havana. The truth is, even in terms of practical learning, this is actually a bit of a major issue. There are those that feel that when you expose Talmidim or yourself to too many different types of approaches, whether it's philosophical or even in Gemara learning, that gets confusing. It's sometimes good to focus laser-like on a particular mahalach. Right? That would be, for example, the Shita of Chabad. Okay, Chabad, it's Yadua, like a very famous criticism of Chabad is they only learn Chabad. Right? They will not say over from the Chavetz Chaim or the Vilna Gaon or anybody else. Only Chabad. Of course, Baruch Hashem, they have hundreds and hundreds of Chabad books, but only Chabad. So what's going on? Why don't they look at everybody else? And the explanation they'll give you is, which, again, I'm not going to dismiss it, is that we want to intensely examine our particular derech and avodas Hashem to understand every nook and cranny and every, crevice, instead of being exposed to so many different ideas that we become, as the expression goes, jack of all trades and master of none. So that would focus on taking one thing, going with it. The Ramak, Badavke here, seems to have a different approach. The Ramak seems to say that Halome, see, it's interesting. Most of us, this is actually Stikol Chiddush, most of us understand the statement, Ezeu Chacham Halomid Mikol Adam, as more of an aspect of humility, meaning I'm willing to learn from everybody. The Ramak is saying a little different. The Ramak is saying it's not a matter of humility. It's a matter of being open to a panorama of perspectives. That's a bit of a different emphasis. Like some people say, it's not right to say, someone asks you, what's the Torah approach about Zionism? Okay, I do a Q&A, right? So we go through this all the time. So I will typically say something like, I'm going to plagiarize myself for a moment here. Satmar Rebbe says this, Rev Kook says this. So people say, take a stand. Rav Kook says this, some Rebbe says this. Why don't you say what it is? So I typically say, well, there are different views. So I'm kind of following what the Ramak is saying, right? But others will say, and again, I'm Badavka saying that there's room for that, is no. You confuse people. There's this, and there's that, and there's that, and there's that. Stick with it. Give people a definitive thing they can hold on to. So maybe consistent with the fact that I give different positions, I'm giving you different positions on that. I'm giving you different positions. Should there be different positions? I make everything into a machlokas, right? Okay. So I'm going to confuse you even on that question. But that's the issue. The issue is, so I just want you to understand the debate here. There is a legitimate debate here. And that is, some say, I have a richer, deeper understanding of Yiddishkeit if I see the different nuances and trends and shitos. Others will say, no, you have a more superficial vision of Yiddishkeit because you're not sticking intensively with a particular mahalach. So Chabad very much endorses that second one. In fact, this is, there's a fascinating book. It's probably out of print, and I'm not sure I would advise you to read it, but it's such a fascinating book. It's called 9.5 Mystics. 9.5 Mystics was written by a Reform rabbi. He's not alive anymore. He's the half mystic, who in the 1950s was journeying around, meeting all these Mekubalim, Orthodox Mekubalim, and writing about his experiences with them. For example, there's a fascinating chapter about Lubavitcher Rebbe before he became Rebbe, etc. Different types of things like this. So at one point he writes about Yechidas, and this Reform rabbi loved Rav Kook. He didn't know Rav Kook, but he loved Rav Kook because Rav Kook is so mystical and this and that. And when he went to see the Rebbe, after the Rebbe became Rebbe, and the Rebbe said something, and this Reform rabbi was so excited, he says, it's exactly what Rav Kook said. Rav Kook said this, and Rav Kook said that. And he noticed that the Rebbe was not responding. So he felt a little abashed. He says, the Rebbe doesn't like Rav Kook, doesn't respect Rav Kook. And the Rebbe said this. The Rebbe said, in 1953, the Rebbe said, Rav Kook was trying to do too much at the same time. He was trying to bring in ideas from everywhere. And the Rebbe said, that confuses people. You got to have a laser-like focus. Okay? So just be aware of the question. Even yeshivas have a different style, right? Some yeshivas have this idea, we have a shita and this is what we do. Other yeshivas try to expose you with a lot of different viewpoints. Each one has a strength. Each one has a chisaron. So the point I'm making is that, interestingly enough, the Ramak's interpretation of a Zeyu Chacham, Halomed Mikol Adam, is an endorsement of the notion of expansiveness. I would just add that in the Pardes Rimonim, that's exactly what he does. The Pardes Rimonim, at least in Kabbalah, is truly an encyclopedia of Kabbalah. He basically brings every different approach to Kabbalah up to his time. That didn't include the Ari. And he tries to bring it under one roof. Different gishot, different approaches in Chachmas HaEmes, because he felt that that's how you appreciate the panorama. Okay, so that's an interesting point, and it's really surprisingly relevant to issues of what type of derech and learning do you have. Now again, practically, my answer would again be that chanoch l'nar al pi darko. Each person, different people need different derechim. Some people need the certainty and intensity of a definitive shita, and other people are more comfortable with exploring different nuances. So I can't even say that one derech is definitely the right derech and one derech is definitely the wrong derech. The answer is that it very much depends on the individual. Some individuals greatly benefit from exposure to many, many approaches. Others do not. In fact, I actually had this discussion, to be honest with you. I had this discussion with the Rav Mendel Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, our own founding Rosh Hashiva of Or Sameach. Rav Mendel is His picture is in the office. Great, a very great man. And somebody complained in the early days. I don't know. Maybe your Talmidim are less hostile than they used to be. But in the early days, people used to complain about the way I taught. They used to say, "Hey, he's always giving this opinion, that opinion, etc." And Reb Mendel talked to me about the idea that maybe Balei Tshuva sometimes need one fundamental approach. I didn't agree with him at the time, but once again, there is wisdom in his words also. So this is a live issue in Chinuch. It really is an issue that Rebbeim are debating in terms of what is the appropriate way of conveying Torah values. Yeah.
Do you think that maybe you do that in the sense that you exclude some opinions entirely? That there's right, because you present the selections. So
No, of course.
there's an element of guidance in
That is correct. That is correct. Obviously, no matter how many different views somebody presents, he is excluding some views beyond the pale. So in a sense, it's guiding you within a broader road. But hopefully you won't get off the road. You won't get off the derech in that way. Yeah, 100% correct. I mean, obviously, nobody is going to say everything. Oh, the reform position on abortion, we need to, we're not going to go there other than to critique it or criticize it and the like. Okay, so this is the idea of Ezeyu Chacham, Halomed Mikal Adam, that you have to be makabel from everybody. Now he then adds an interesting thing which is very problematical. Once again, throughout this discussion, he has not differentiated Netzach and Hod in any possible way. In other words, either they're both the supporters of Tiferes, or they are both the Talmidim of Tiferes. So when you support Torah, you're linking to Netzach and Hod. And when you learn from your Rebbeim, all Rebbeim, you are connected to the Talmidim, which are Netzach and Hod. But he has not differentiated Netzach from Hod in any way. But at the end of his discussion, all of a sudden he says, there is something unique to Netzach and something unique to Hod. And this is what he says. It's actually schwer. He says, Netzach is to the right. Right? Netzach is the right thigh, or the right leg. And therefore it is in the same directional plane as Chesed. Hod is to the left. It's the left leg. So it's the same directional plane as Gevurah. So he then says, when you learn from your different Rebbeim, Torah shebichsav is on the right. It's noted to Chesed. So therefore you're more connected to Netzach. Torah shebichsav. When you learn Mishnah is connected to Gevurah. Mishnah is to the left. So you're more connected to Hod. So when you learn Gemara, which combines Torah shebichsav and Mishnah by giving you the drashos, etc., then you're connecting to both Netzach and Hod. So this is an interesting point, that Torah shebichsav is mekusher to Netzach, which is connected to Chesed. Torah shebal peh is connected to Hod, which is connected to Gevurah, meaning Torah shebal peh, meaning Mishnah. Gemara is drawing on both. So, whatever this means exactly, Torah shebichsav is the right, and Torah shebal peh is the left. So, l'chaira, we have to check this. This seems to contradict a Kabbalistic minhag that is brought down in Poskim as well. You may have heard this, that some have a shita that you are not allowed to learn Torah shebichsav at night. It may be Nogei Shnaya Mikra at night, etc. Some will not learn Tanakh at night, and some will not even say Tehillim at night. Now, many don't follow this minhag at all. I mean, I'm not telling you to even follow it, but some have a zehiras. They do not learn Tanakh at night. And the reason that's given, it seems to be a tzorachin, I'm going to have to I didn't have time to check into this, is that night is a time of Gevurah. It's a time of Hester Panim. It's a time of concealment of the divine. It's a time of strict judgment. And Mikra represents Midas Hadin. So we don't want to add gasoline to Gevurah. We don't want to strengthen the Gevurah by being osek in Mikra at night, because night is Gevurah and Mikra is Gevurah. So we don't want to do Gevurah when there's Gevurah. So if that's the case, I mean, that's exactly the opposite, meaning right now I'll just throw it out as a question and I'll try to look into it. That the Ramak says over here that Mikra is the Yamin, which is Netzach, connected to Chesed. Mishnah is to the Smol, which is Hod, connected to Gevurah. Gemara says both. So according to that, what should really be prohibited is to learn Mishnah at night. Because Mishnah is the Gevurah. Of course, we have to explain why is it Gevurah. That we haven't even looked at anyway. Why is this called Gevurah? Why is that called Chesed? We'll talk about that later too. But just in terms of nomenclatures, if the idea is you don't want to add Gevurah to Gevurah, then Mishnah should be the thing that you don't learn rather than Mikra. Yeah?
Is it possible to say that Mikra is Gevurah Shebenetzach and Mishnah would be Chesed Shebehod? Filling both?
Okay, that's a possibility. Okay, you have to work it out. Let me think about it. Okay, so we'll look at this a little more, because it is the only line in all of Perek Ches that suggests some differentiation. That's why I want to just intellectually curious to explore this a little bit. This is the only line in the Perek where some differentiation is made between Netzach and Hod, and at least superficially seems to contradict the well-known Kabbalistic stringency of not learning Mikra at night. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying this as a halacha. I mean, after all, at Ma'ariv, we say Tehillim at night. I mean, we say Tehillim at night. But there are those who would not. There are those who would not say any Tehillim at night, because you don't want to add Gevurah to Gevurah. So, Mr. Hashem, we'll look at this next week. Okay? Here we go.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.